We're at war with every country on the face of the earth. We estimate that there were between 5,000 and 10,000 individuals involved in piracy one way or another, under the command of 70 different captains.
With no home port, pirates began to range far and wide. From the 1690s onward, no corner of the globe, no trade route was totally guaranteed. Now it was the trade routes from Africa, loaded with ivory and dazzling gems, that caught the pirate imagination. Or the fragrant casks of spices and silks from India and Persia and the Moluccas. That was the stuff of dreams. It was a good time to be a pirate. World trade was expanding into exotic markets. But for most of the 17th and 18th centuries, the great world navies, British, Spanish, Dutch, and French, were at each other's throats. They'd no time to protect their merchant vessels, and no time for pirates. That's when the old idea of privateering was dusted off. This time not as a weapon against shipping, but against pirates. And the first man to try this was called William Kidd. A Scotsman living in New York, he serves as a royalist privateer with distinction and marries well. He uses these contacts to secure a commission to rove the East Indies, relieve pirate ships of their booty, and return the loot to America for the colonial government.
Next.
He'd need seasoned veterans, men who aren't squeamish or finicky. He finds them in the quayside taverns and ordinaries of New York. He finds his old privateering crew, in fact.
Gunner's mate.
I'm not sure that pirate hunting was all that they had in mind. He recruits crewmen. Among them are men that he knows to be pirates. Some of those men were sailors who had run away with his own ship 10 years earlier. Would he have hired them if he had honest intentions in mind?
My name is William Kidd. When I sailed, my name is William Kidd. When I sailed.
On September 6th, 1696, Kidd set sail. His is a motley crew, 152 dangerous men en route eastward to do the king's work. This is no patient and forgiving crew, and conditions aboard Kidd's ship Adventure Galley are terrible. Remember, this is a time that even when ships were good, they were bad, as the magisterial Dr. Johnson understood.
No man will be a sailor who has contrivance enough to get himself into a jail. For being in a ship is being in jail with the chance of being drowned. A man in jail has more room, better food, and commonly better company.
Now, of course, here we have the forecastle.
And the ship's galley.
The irony, of course, is that it was only in pleasant conditions, with sunshine and nice, easygoing situations, that you would actually have hot food. Something like this, where you really needed the hot food, as you can see, it would be impossible to maintain the fire, and you're living off of cold gruel and a hunk of bread.
Yeah. The bread would usually be infested with either weevils or maggots, and it's my understanding that Royal Navy men preferred it when it was infested with maggots, on account of the weevils left a bitter aftertaste. Kids' men, as an extra bit of a treat, would have a piece of cheese as part of their ration, but even that had its own special horrors, because there was a long, thin, and nasty worm that dwelt in the bowels of the cheese that was particularly wretched and horrendous and vile tasting.
For this crew especially, all work and no prey got old way too soon. They began to murmur and complain. When one is a bit too vocal, Kidd flies into a rage. Next day, the man is buried at sea.
He was a hard-driving, strong-willed captain. The kind of strong-willed captain that could easily cause a crew to mutiny. On the other hand, the kind of strong-willed captain who would often succeed.
Kidd is now at large with scant prospects on the vast Indian Ocean. Despairing of finding a pirate ship to attack and its booty to confiscate in the name of the law, he fixes on the idea of boarding the very next ship that appears. And that is the Quetta Merchant, an undefended ship in the lucrative India trade. Kidd knows it to be a protected vessel, but flying a false flag, he seizes her anyway. It would be his greatest mistake. The Quetta's owner has connections. The India trade threatens to boycott Britain unless the Admiralty puts a stop to Kidd. But for the moment at least, Kidd has a worthy cargo: silk, muslin, calico, sugar, and opium. William Kidd, pirate hunter, had become Captain Kidd, pirate. At heart, the Kidd tale raises an enduring question about the real adversary of many pirates: the changing winds of British colonial and imperial policy. The government had put him in the role of ship stealer. Lacking legitimate ships to plunder, what else could he do? Off Madagascar, Kidd abandons his old ship in favor of the Quetta, which he renames Adventure's Prize. By the time he returns to North America, London's East India Company and the Crown are calling for his head. Kidd's response is to propagate rumors that he buried treasure all over the world. In the South China Sea, in the Caribbean, and even in British North America. None is ever found. Kidd is a hunted and haunted man. What he needs is time. Plainly, he could defend himself in any sort of fair trial. After all, everyone knows the Sir Henry Morgan saga. Kidd, too, could well come back from the courts a hero. Meanwhile, his wealth would be safe underground. Kidd abandons his great ship at Hispaniola and sails a small sloop back to New York. At last, in 1699, he fetches up on Gardiner's Island off Long Island Sound. And it is here, some claim, that bits of the Kidd treasure still exist.
This is where it all began. All the marvelous treasure hunting stories that have entertained us through childhood. For it's here that in 1699, Captain Kidd's buried treasure. It's perhaps the most famous buried treasure of all time.
But Kidd will never see his treasure or Ireland again. Arrested, he is on his way to London's infamous Newgate prison. The faintest echo of his glorious world still reverberates in a single surviving artifact.
This is a small piece of what was then known as cloth of gold, silk with gold thread woven through it. Well, according to Gardner family tradition, Kidd was so grateful for a dinner of roast pork that Mrs. Gardner had prepared for him that he gave her this silk cloth of gold, and that it was then made into dresses for her daughters, and that a portion of one of these dresses was kept as a family heirloom.
In London, Kidd is convicted of piracy. On May 23rd, 1701, 200,000 people come to Execution Dock on the banks of the Thames to witness Kidd's last breath. Not a few are hoping he'll reveal where he buried his loot. But he is drunken and sullen to the end. Kidd's life was a record of bad choices and constant and bitter violence. Said a member of Parliament, "I thought him only a knave, and now know him to be a fool as well. Many a felonious sailor had met his end in the gibbet, a sort of metal cage to hold a hangman's bones. The dangling man was meant as a warning to all incoming seamen. Kidd's bones guarded the entrance to the Thames for 4 years. Plainly, there were hazards in going on account as a pirate. But this was an age when you could swing for stealing a loaf of bread or a handkerchief. To many, there seemed little reason not to be a pirate. At least that kept you out of the clutches of the press gangs, thugs who roamed every harbor, brutally kidnapping crewmen for service in the Royal Navy.
There was 850 men in this ship, and 60% were not on board a class of ship like this voluntarily. They were seconded, and it was legal to do that. They were pressed men, hence the press gangs. The ship's company would go ashore and take a quantity of people off the streets to bring them on board, and that's where they stayed. So there were 600 people on board not wanting to be here. And so in order to get them to do what you wanted them to do, you had to have a strict discipline regime, and there was. For an example, if you had a situation where you had theft on board, then the perpetrator would have probably run the gauntlet. Running the gauntlet would have been you have 50% of the ship's company on one side of the ship, 50% of it on the other side in a row, and the perpetrator would have been invited or ordered or actually at the end of a bayonet would be tasked to go from one end to the other through these row of people. Each person was given a rope's end, and as the poor man went through, he was then whacked across the back or the legs or the head or wherever until he got to the other end. And they all felt empowered, and the bloke really felt as if he deserved what he got, because everybody felt better, except for the perpetrator, of course.
Flogging was the great enforcer on the high seas, by way of the cat-o'-nine tails. Each sailor to be flogged had to make the instrument of his own torture by unbraiding a length of line into its 3 strands, and then each of those into 3 more, 9 tails. But cats could only be used once, lest their bloody strands infect and probably kill their next victim.
Everybody knew exactly where your boundaries were. And if you crossed those boundaries, then you would be punished if you were found out. And that actually was a very good, strict way of controlling 60% of the ship's company that didn't want to be here. So they knew where their boundaries were, rather like children.
There was only one defense: jumping ship to become a pirate. Thousands of Royal Navy and merchant seamen made this choice.
One gang, for example, that was composed not only of Englishmen, Irishmen, Scots, and Welsh, but there were also Frenchmen, Dutchmen, Swedes, North Germans, Belgians, colonials of all different ancestries, Native Americans from 2 separate tribes, and some 50 persons of African heritage, either former slaves, runaway slaves, or freemen.
There were many negotiable and lucrative commodities trading on the seas. In the 17th and 18th centuries, humans were among those goods. So slavers were valuable ships to intercept. Most slaves were sold on, but some could join the pirate crew.
For a black man who was captured by pirates meant that he had a unique opportunity. Because on board pirate vessels, blacks were treated as equals. We know that some blacks were elected as officers and captains of predominantly white crews. Some of the most successful pirates in history were black men. And it's a terrible irony that during the early 18th century, perhaps the most powerful place for a black man in the Western world was the deck of a pirate ship.
Oddly, because a pirate crew was the haunt of cutthroats and villains, a sort of truce settled over shipboard life, centered around an informal pact.
Peace, pistols and cutlass, clean and fit for service.
Some pirate voyages started with each man signing such a contract.
No striking one another on board, but every man's quarrels to be ended on shore at sword and pistol.
Every man has a vote in the affairs of the moment. We're dealing with the first democracy in some sense. Every man to be called fairly in turn by list on board of prizes, meaning everybody gets a proper share. The lights and candles to be put out at 8 o'clock at night. No striking one another on board. If you had a beef, you took your squabble ashore. No man to talk of breaking up their way of living, till each had shared 1,000 pounds.
Here at last was a real floating republic, every man having a say in his destiny. And when they came to choose a destination, many opted for the Caribbean.
The Caribbean was an ideal hunting ground for the pirates. In the first place, the weather was a damn sight better than the North Sea or the North Atlantic, and pirates like good weather. But the main thing was it was on major trade routes. Ships coming from Africa across to America all went through the Caribbean. And for a pirate on the run, and of course they were always on the run from the authorities, it provided literally thousands of hiding places.
Nassau on the island of New Providence in the Bahamas had become the new pirate base. Here they came between rovings to rest and parcel out their ill-gotten gains. Sooner or later, every vicious pirate passed through this harbor. So far, their ranks had been filled by a certain predictable class: the poor, the outsider, the social and political misfit, the maltreated sailor. But there was another disaffected and powerless group to draw from as well: women. One was particularly nasty. Her name is Anne Bonny.
Anne Bonny was the illegitimate daughter of a solicitor. She rather disgraced her father by running off with a man who describes as being not worth a groat. I think he was a sailor, and disappointed her parents' expectations. And it also mentions in the story that she had a ferocious temper. I mean, there's one anecdote that she actually sliced off a woman's nose in an argument.
In New Providence, Anne abandons her bland sailor husband in favor of a racy pirate called Calico Jack Rackham.
The appeal of piracy to women would have been huge. I mean, it was all about escape. It was about escaping the confines of home and children. And young girls would often dream about running off to sea in the same way that boys would.
In no time, Anne and Calico Jack steal a ship in Nassau Harbor and sail off on account. From one of their first prizes, a Dutch ship, they take on board a handsome young crewman who catches Anne's fancy. But something seems faintly unusual about the lad, and he is odd. In fact, he's a girl. A circumstance she confides only to Anne. The crewman's name is Mary Read.
One of the points of similarity between Mary Read and Anne Bonny's story is that Mary Read was also illegitimate. She, however, was raised as a boy from birth because her brother had died. Her brother, who was legitimate, had died, and her mother was sort of passing Mary off as her brother to her mother-in-law in order to get some sort of family income and support. And at the age of 13, her mother had fallen on hard times and sends Mary off to be a kind of serving man, serving boy to a Frenchwoman.
Fed up with the circumscribed life allowed to 18th century women, Mary Read ran away to the War of Spanish Succession, dashing as a cavalryman through Flanders.
Lads again, you're not causing me any trouble today, I hope.
After that fray, she posed as a sailor on a Dutch ship, the very one that brought her to Calico Jack and Anne Bonny. The question is, how did she manage to conceal herself from her crewmates for so long? Nicky Alford has been sailing tall ships for 10 years.
I think disguise would have been very difficult. I guess they could have cut their hair short, worn loose clothing. Mostly it's your hands and your feet get very rough and worn. Everyone runs barefoot everywhere, and it's all rope. And your hands, of course, from pulling on ropes, it's like a friction burn, and you get very hard calluses on the palms of your hands and on your fingers. That's about the most change, apart from, of course, big upper body muscles. Everyday life would have been quite hard, the actual personal side of it, like going to the toilets. You'd possibly get away with it at night by creeping up forward onto what were the heads, is the cat heads. They're big wooden pieces of timber where the anchors are hung, and hung yourself off there like the rest of the men. Just go at night rather than in the day.
At sea, Bonny and Read are beyond the reach of society's conventions. They could be as nonconformist and as fierce, as unladylike as they pleased. Off the coast of Jamaica, all three are captured, with only the women putting up much resistance. The men are drunk. Later, Anne scorned Jack Rackham. "If you had fought like a man," she said, "you need not have been hanged like a dog."
They were as fierce as any of the male pirates that you can imagine. When they were finally trapped by a British frigate and their ship was being overwhelmed, their crew fled below decks, leaving only the women on deck, fighting like demons.
Anne and Mary are brought to trial at the Admiralty Court, Spanish Town, Jamaica. This was news.
Well, when Mary Read and Anne Bonny were tried in 1720, it caused a huge sensation both in Jamaica and back in England. It was the first time that there was hard, concrete evidence that women actually had been pirates. I mean, there was plenty of sort of stories about them and ballads about them, but this was the first time that we knew they really existed. And it was as if a fantasy had been made real.
Evidence offered in court passes almost immediately into legend and folklore.
The lead and boldly went aloft. Just 36 months she braved the tempest cold, and always done her duty did
The witnesses seem to sense they are part of history.
Both of the women were very profligate, cursing and swearing much. They did not seem to be kept or detained by force.
The two women wore men's trousers. Each of them had a machete and a pistol and cursed and swore at the men to murder me. I knew they were women by the largeness of their breasts.
Neither Anne nor Mary testify in their defense. Why? Because they have a trump card. They can plead their bellies.
They were tried, they were sentenced to hang, but they couldn't hang the ladies because they were both pregnant. And under English common law, that was something that you couldn't do. And so they escaped the hangman's noose. Mary Read had her infant, and they both died of fever in the tropics in Jamaica. Anne Bonny, no one knows what happened to her, but she didn't hang.
Actually, sworn testimony at pirate trials is a surprisingly sharp-focused source of information. It shows quite clearly, for instance, just how pirates managed their attacks. And as the age of piracy progressed, pirate tactics got refined and improved. But their methods are still there, part of the public legal record.
In the Caribbean, there was a standard method of attack. The pirate ship would see a ship on the horizon, it would come closer and it would shadow that ship for quite a while, working out how many men there were on board, whether it was well armed, whether it was worth attacking. They would then move up closer, probably flying friendly flags in order to lull the crew into a sense of security. They might even come right up close and ask for water or something like that. And then at the last moment, all the crew would appear on deck, maximum noise, maximum terror. Most merchant ships in the Caribbean had tiny crews with perhaps a few token cannon. A pirate ship was loaded with men. Even quite small pirate ships had crews of 50, 60, very often 200 or 300 men. It was a totally unequal battle.
Intimidation was a very real weapon, and the pirate ensign was meant to make the blood run cold.
Bones, skeletons, skulls, crossed femurs, sometimes a bony hand. They were all symbols of death. Death being what the victim could expect if he didn't surrender pronto. The earliest pirate flag was a plain red field. The Joli Rouge, the French called it, meaning the pretty red. The English called it the bloody flag. It was in use until about 1700, at which point it was replaced by the black flag. The black flag. This one, the classic skull and crossbones, used by several pirates in the early 1700s, but all pirates made their own flag with their own variations.
The hope, as always, was that the conquest could be made without a shot being fired. But if not, there are so many ways a cannonball can wreak havoc. Colin Harriott has studied them all.
Well, as you can see, the cannonball hasn't come right the way through the wall of wood. It's stuck in there, but it has pushed out these great big jagged splinters which are just about to detach themselves. And that's only with a 6-pound arm ball. Imagine the devastation of a 24-pounder or a 32-pound cannonball coming through a wall of wood like this. A shower of splinters everywhere. Absolute hell on earth. But I think we're going to have to try again, and this time we're going to put a little bit more gunpowder down the gun. We'll slam her in a bit harder for you. Well, I suppose we're about 25, 30 yards, fairly close for a small gun. This was the range that these would be firing at, which gives us the ability to fire with a flat trajectory or point blank. The phrase point blank now come to mean firing very close, but in its original form it meant to fire at a flat trajectory. So you had to be fairly close. And that's what we're going to do. Yes. Now that's more like it. These are the splinters I've been telling you about. Imagine those flying everywhere. Look at the points on them. Jagged, horrible. Kill anything. The whole point of a cannonball is to smash through the hull, to cause damage. It's not the cannonball which kills people, although a cannonball hitting somebody will make a nasty mess of them. It's the splinters, the debris. They are the real killers. The cannonball does the smashing, and the splinters do the rest. the cat, give him fire!
Pirates knew the score. They were always facing dangerous weather. It's why there are so many peglegs in pirate history and in pirate fiction, like Long John Silver. Still, that must have seemed a small price to pay for the possibility, at least, of vast riches. Many were willing to take the gamble, with one interesting and surprising hedge on that bet.
One of the most surprising things about pirates is the medical insurance scheme which pirates established if they lost limbs in battle. And the convention was that the right hand or the right arm was the most valuable. So if you lost that, you got 500 pieces of 8. The left hand was 400 pieces of 8, so much for a leg. And if you lost an eye, you just got 100 pieces of 8. It says a lot for the way they determined their rule in a very undemocratic age.
It's notions like that that give pirate history its schizophrenic character. Were they brave and noble, or just bloody and bloody-minded?
It's important not to think of the pirates as heroes. They shouldn't be. They were hard, brutal, and vicious men. While many of the gangs were described as decent and humane even by their victims, there were crews out there who would have made extraordinarily good studies in group sociopathology. Pirate brutality lived up to anything that we've seen in the movies, and worse.
Movies depict pirates who regularly force victims to walk the plank. But there is only one recorded instance of that in history, and that was in 1829, at the very end of the pirate era. Still, there were many other ways of getting hostages to talk. All of them torture.
They particularly went for the captain, and if it was discovered that the captain had been cruel to his crew, they would simply cut his throat and throw him overboard, or torture him before throwing him overboard. It was the pirates getting their own back, really, because most of them were former seamen, getting their own back on the people who persecuted them in the past.
Infinitely unrelenting and gruesome are the varieties of pirate torture. One ship's captain tied all his gold to a rope and dangled it out his cabin window. He cut the rope just as he was being captured. His lips were sliced off and cooked in front of him. Another pirate would eviscerate his captors, forcing them to dance away from their unraveling guts. But there was also a slow torture, actually the slowest, though it often had the same inevitable result. It was called marooning or abandoning on some wretched island. It was not the paradise we regard a tropical island today. With only a pistol and a Bible, the maroon man faced sure death. Marooning was the penalty that gave us one of the greatest novels of all time, Robinson Crusoe.
Robinson Crusoe was certainly the most famous of all castaways, but Daniel Defoe based him on a real character who was Alexander Selkirk. He was a Scottish pirate who was on a privateering expedition. He had an argument with his ship's captain, who left him on the island of Juan Fernandez. He was left with a certain amount of gear. He had a pistol and a hatchet and a knife and a Bible, which he always maintained kept him going through the hard times. He was actually there for 4 years and 4 days, and when he was eventually picked up, he could hardly speak any English.
Wild goats left by earlier Spanish explorers were Selkirk's mainstay, furnishing him with cloaks, umbrellas, and dinner. He hunted them by chasing them off cliffs. Selkirk regarded himself as a new Adam in a new Eden. This was an era when even pirates saw themselves as modern incarnations of biblical heroes. He joyfully sang psalms to the birds and to all of God's creation. Tinge of guilt here. Like Defoe's Robinson Crusoe, Selkirk considered himself a far better Christian marooned than he ever was at home in England. In 1709, Captain Woodes Rogers picked up Selkirk and brought him home. Rogers himself was a former privateer who in time became governor of the Bahamas, ruling there between 1718 and 1732. Rogers was selected because he was used to pirate ways and pirate perfidy. It was under his rule that Bonny, Reed, and Rackham came to their ends. But the one who got away from Rogers was Blackbeard. Actually, for the Blackbeard story, it's not so much the life that recommends him to posterity. It's the death. Nothing became him so much as his end. That was the one legends are made of. After his ill-advised blockade of Charleston, Edward Teach knew he'd gone too far. Soon as he could, Blackbeard made for the coves and inlets that riddle Carolina's outer banks.
He'd realized that he had thrown up a red flag, and he was very high profile following the blockade of Charleston. And I think he came to the conclusion that it was about time to downsize the crew. So when they came up here to Beaufort Inlet, he ran the Queen Anne's Revenge aground out here on the bar.
Archaeologist Dave Moore and his team are investigating what they believe to be the last and final resting place of Queen Anne's Revenge. So far, they've recovered 2 anchors and many cannons. They all suggest this was a large warship, possibly even Blackbeard's.
With the Queen Anne's Revenge being located, if indeed we can prove that she is, it's only the 3rd pirate ship, to my knowledge, that has been located anywhere in the world. So that certainly adds a certain amount of significance to this particular shipwreck, apart from its obvious association with Blackbeard the pirate, perhaps one of the most notorious pirates that ever sailed.
Blackbeard consigned his great ship to the deep in November of 1718. Then, aboard the Adventure, a small sloop of just 10 guns, he headed for the Ocracoke Inlet.
The trees over here is what they call Springer's Point. This is where Blackbeard had his hideout. There's still an old well back in there from the Blackbeard days. They had this huge pirate party here on Ocracoke, and supposedly it was the largest gathering of pirates in North America. And there was talk of fortifying Ocracoke as a pirate haven, making it into a fort.
On the 18th of November, Lieutenant Robert Maynard, in command of the sloops Ranger and Jane, set out from the Chesapeake to deal with Blackbeard. Maynard knew what he was up against. But if he could bring down this malefactor, Maynard's place in history would be assured. But did he have the firepower? Did he have the guts? At night on November 21st, Maynard got the first view of his quarry. A pirate party was in full swing, but Blackbeard was alone and feared the worst.
He didn't really know who it was, but he figured they'd send somebody to kill him, so he was pretty much walking back and forth all night long, and one of the Like Ocracoke, one of the way Ocracoke got his name was Blackbeard was saying "Oh cock crow," trying to get the chicken to crow the next morning so he could see who it was they sent to kill him.
Morning revealed it wasn't the Royal Navy at all, but merely 2 minor sloops. Blackbeard laughed. What he didn't realize was that the sloops had been specifically selected for chasing Blackbeard through the shallow waters he knew so well.
Robert Maynard, they had to come up attack against the wind back and forth because the channel's very narrow. And they said Blackbeard had secret channels where only he knew about it, and he would trick the ships into running aground.
At first, things seemed to be going Blackbeard's way. Ranger approaches his ship and receives a withering broadside. Guns worth of swan shot, nails, and scrap iron. 6 are killed and 10 wounded. Now Blackbeard turns to finish off his second pursuer, the Jane, Maynard's own ship. Smartly, the lieutenant pilfers an old pirate trick, keeping his crew below deck, making it appear his little ship too is abandoned. Blackbeard can taste his victory.
Let's board her and cut him to pieces and give no quarter. But wait, surely there was more than this on board. Where's the rest of them? Where are they? Surely they be hiding. Then from the holds of the sloop, we were surrounded by British Marines from the bow, the stern, the port, the starboard. Why, there must have been 80 of them. Oh, there could have been no more than 18 of my men left. They fought diligently, but it grew more and more hopeless. And then, the sea began to grow red with our own blood. Lieutenant Robert Maynard of the Royal English Navy turns towards me, he does. I stare at him, he stare at me. And then his cowardly head swordsman slashes the side of me neck. I felt the bitter burn as blood started to trickle down my chest. Lieutenant Maynard takes his pistol and he aims that pistol right at my heart, and then my face splattered against the splintered boards. Then I heard the command, "Off with his head!" Seaman Chapman Gurley takes his finely honed sword and quickly, but oh so carefully, he does cut Blackbeard's head from Blackbeard's body.
Still, Blackbeard lives on in folklore. Even in these enlightened times, his headless body is often reported swimming round Ocracoke Inlet. It's so common a sight, these murky waters are also known as Teach's Hole. As the 18th century wears on, pirating declines, chiefly because more and more Royal Naval might can be devoted to pirates. Hard to imagine a pirate ship surviving an attack from a British ship of the line.
This ship was a gun platform. She was only designed to go from A to B and to protect the sea lanes. Any pirate that came within about a mile against this ship, 140 guns coming your way, I think perhaps you might want to turn turtle and get out quickly. I certainly would.
After the first half of the 18th century, pirating has seen its day. England has made peace with Spain, and the licensing of privateers, which created generations of social and nautical misfits, is now coming to a close. In a way, pirates had only themselves to blame for their sudden end. Their violence, their greed, brought the wrath of the world down on them. And no pirate story illustrates this more than that of Bart Roberts.
Bartholomew Roberts was the most alarming and terrifying and the most successful of all the pirates. He was not the most famous. Blackbeard was much more famous. He had a good sort of propaganda machine. But Bartholomew Roberts is reputed to have attacked 400 ships in his lifetime. And I've read numerous accounts by the governors of islands. I've read captains' logbooks, and there's no doubt that he had an amazing record of attacking ships. He appears to have been a rather stern, disciplined man, fairly good looking. He was dark and saturnine. He was also extremely savage in his treatment of ships that he attacked. Cut people's ears and noses off, and on one occasion he nailed some seamen to the mast as an example. So a very terrifying character.
Appropriately, Roberts became a pirate after his own ship was stolen in 1719. A sober and orderly man, he preferred tea to alcohol, knowing it to stand in the way of his ruthless efficiency. Port by port, he swept down the African coast. At the slavers' harbor of Wita, Roberts came upon a dozen ships. All surrendered immediately, except the brig Porcupine. This so enraged Roberts' mates, they soaked her decks in tar and torched her. Trouble was, the ship had 80 slaves in its hold. A horrified onlooker reported they were under the miserable choice of perishing by either fire or water. But it was a new world, under new rules. The Empire was about to strike back. The Royal Navy caught up with Roberts off Cape Lopez in the Gulf of Guinea on February the 10th, 1722. Roberts was trapped. While his crew dragged themselves legless, Bart Roberts dressed in his finest. Crimson waistcoat and breeches, feathered hat, sash with pistols. He then calmly awaited the end.
The most amazing thing is that the whole battle took place in a full gale off the coast of Africa. Gales sweeping across the decks, water everywhere.
As the unequal battle raged, a blast of grape shot tore away Roberts's throat. His constant request while he lived was that his body be tossed overboard rather than be liable to the gibbet as some pathetic moral lesson. That request was granted.
The final battle of Bartholomew Roberts, the most ferocious of the pirates, was the end of an era. From that date onwards, the Navy was simply doing a mopping up operation. And I think what my final vision of that, the end of the great age of piracy, is on the little islands outside every seaport around the coast of the Atlantic, the bodies of pirates, tarred to preserve them, being pecked by seagulls, but a warning to seamen that that's what happens to pirates.
52 members of Bart Roberts' crew were hanged, the greatest mass execution of pirates ever. It was an inglorious end to a mostly shameful history. There had been high points of freedom, of utopia, of seafaring equality, but most were mere dreams, mainly dreams of avarice. Their victims' ends tell a far more accurate and instructive tale.
Ironically, the pirates that we are most familiar with, men like Captain Kidd, Blackbeard, Bart Roberts, were in essence losers. The successful pirates were the men who were able to operate in the shadows year after year after year. The ones that were able to make their fortunes, and finally, at the end of all that, dying peaceably in bed.
Buccaneering, pirating, privateering, and all manner of roving had mostly run out of grog. In the end, it's as if we, the future, have been marooned with only the lines from Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island to comfort us. 15 men on a dead man's chest, yo-ho-ho and a bottle of rum. Drink that the devil had done for the rest, yo-ho-ho and a bottle of rum. How nice it would be if that were all there was to the pirate's story.